Captain James Mitchell had been in the military for 17 years, but nothing quite prepared a soldier for the moment when everything changes in a single heartbeat. The morning had started like countless others, a routine reconnaissance patrol through the mountainous terrain of a volatile region. The sun climbed higher in the cloudless sky, casting long shadows across the rocky slopes. Mitchell's unit of 137 soldiers marched in disciplined formation, their weapons ready but their minds perhaps slightly complacent after weeks of uneventful patrols. The intelligence briefing that morning had suggested the area was relatively clear, which meant no immediate threats. Mitchell, however, had learned long ago not to trust intelligence reports completely. In his experience, the most dangerous moments came when soldiers became comfortable, when their guard dropped even slightly. He kept his eyes scanning the ridge lines, the scattered boulders, and the dense patches of vegetation that dotted the mountain landscape. The narrow mountain pass they were traversing was both beautiful and treacherous. Ancient stone formations rose on either side, creating natural walls that formed a corridor. The path beneath their feet was uneven, forcing soldiers to watch their footing while simultaneously maintaining tactical awareness. It was a challenging environment, one that demanded complete attention and focus. Mitchell's sergeant, a grizzled veteran named Tom Parker with 2 tours under his belt, walked beside him. Parker was one of those soldiers you could trust with your life, steady, experienced, and blessed with an almost supernatural ability to sense danger before it materialized. As they moved deeper into the valley, Parker leaned closer to Mitchell and whispered, "Something feels off, Captain. I can't put my finger on it, but something doesn't feel right." Mitchell nodded slowly. He'd learned to trust Parker's instincts. The sergeant had saved his life twice before, once by identifying a hidden insurgent before he could trigger an IED, and another time by noticing a sniper's glint before the shooter could acquire his target. "Stay sharp," Mitchell responded quietly, raising his hand to signal the column to maintain heightened awareness. He watched as the message rippled down the line, soldiers tightening their grips on their weapons and widening their scan patterns. The younger soldiers, some barely out of their teens, looked around nervously, sensing their leader's tension. Mitchell understood the dynamic well. Experienced soldiers could sense danger like animals sensed a predator approaching. The atmosphere in the valley seemed to shift. A few birds that had been chirping moments before suddenly fell silent. The very air seemed to hold its breath. Then came the sound that every soldier dreads, the unmistakable crack of an ambush opening fire. The explosion came without warning. An IED detonated 30 meters ahead, sending a column of smoke and debris skyward. The concussive blast knocked several soldiers off their feet. Before Mitchell could even process what was happening, gunfire erupted from multiple directions, from the ridgeline above, from behind the boulders, from positions that suddenly revealed themselves across the valley. The coordinated attack was devastating and perfectly executed. Enemy fighters had been waiting, hidden among the rocks and vegetation, for the American unit to reach the optimal kill zone. Mitchell threw himself behind the nearest boulder, his mind immediately shifting into combat mode. Around him, his soldiers did the same, returning fire with the discipline that training had instilled in them. But the situation became apparent within seconds. They weren't in a position to hold. The enemy had superior positioning, and their volume of fire was overwhelming. "Contact left, contact right, contact from above," soldiers were shouting. Mitchell's radio operator, a young specialist named James Chen, was already calling for support, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. Bullets were tearing through the air, ricocheting off rocks with high-pitched whines. The sound was almost deafening, overlapping volleys of machine gun fire, the crack of individual rifle shots, and the periodic crump of explosions as enemy mortar rounds began landing. One of Mitchell's junior officers, Lieutenant David Torres, had taken cover about 20 meters away. Mitchell could see Torres coordinating his squad's defensive fire, organizing them into a coherent response. Several soldiers were already bleeding from wounds inflicted by the initial assault. A medic named Sarah Johnson crawled forward, staying low, moving between wounded soldiers and providing what care she could while still maintaining cover. Mitchell assessed the terrain with a desperate tactical mind. The valley walls were steep and unclimbable on either side. The route they'd come from was now under heavy fire, cutting off any retreat. To their front, the valley narrowed even further before opening into a wider area perhaps 100 meters ahead, but reaching that area would require crossing open ground under direct fire. It was a perfect ambush. Whoever had set this trap had studied the terrain carefully and chosen their moment perfectly. Enemy fighters were emerging from positions that had been completely invisible moments before, their discipline and organization suggesting this was a well-trained force, not just random insurgents. Mitchell could see at least 100 enemy combatants visible from his current position, and that was likely only a fraction of their total force. "Casualty report," Mitchell shouted into his radio, his voice cutting through the chaos. Reports came back grimly. 3 soldiers down, confirmed killed. Another 8 wounded, with at least 2 requiring immediate medical attention. They hadn't even been in contact for 2 minutes, and already they'd suffered significant losses. The enemy's fire intensified, forcing Mitchell's soldiers to hug their cover more tightly. Several soldiers began returning fire with carefully aimed shots, taking advantage of any glimpse of an enemy position. But the volume of incoming fire was relentless. Mitchell's mind raced through options. They couldn't advance. The enemy positions were too strong. They couldn't retreat. That direction was cut off. They couldn't stay in their current positions for long. Ammunition would run out, and the enemy would eventually achieve effective suppression. It was then that the reality struck Mitchell with the force of a sledgehammer. They were pinned down in an indefensible position against a well-organized enemy force that held the high ground, and they were running low on ammunition. His eyes locked with Sergeant Parker's across the 10 meters that separated them. Parker held up 5 fingers, then made a gesture toward his ammunition pouches. Mitchell's stomach tightened. 5 minutes of ammunition. That was all they had left at current burn rate. 5 minutes before their defensive capability would be essentially exhausted. After that, they would be sitting ducks, unable to defend themselves effectively against an enemy that clearly outnumbered them significantly. Mitchell made a decision that would define the next few hours of his life. He keyed his radio, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his chest. "This is command to all stations. We have approximately 5 minutes of ammunition remaining. We are calling in air support immediately. All units maintain defensive positions and conserve ammunition. Return fire only on clear targets. Help is coming." He didn't know if help was actually coming or how far away it might be. But his soldiers needed to believe they would survive this. They needed to have hope, because without hope, without the belief that rescue was possible, they would break. And if they broke now, if their discipline collapsed, then 137 soldiers would die in this valley. Mitchell reached for his radio handset with a trembling hand, took a deep breath, and began calling for the help that he desperately prayed was close enough to make a difference. Major Sarah, Raven, Chen had earned her call sign not because of her dark hair or her obsidian eyes, but because of her ability to see things in combat that others missed, to spot targets hidden in plain sight, to identify threats before they materialized, and to execute complex maneuvers with the precision of a bird of prey hunting in darkness. At 34 years old, she was one of the few female combat pilots in her squadron, a distinction she'd fought tooth and nail to achieve. The military establishment hadn't always welcomed women into combat roles, and Chen had experienced her share of resistance, skepticism, and outright hostility. But she transformed that adversity into fuel, using the doubts others expressed as motivation to become better, sharper, and more capable than her male counterparts. Over 14 years of service, she'd racked up impressive statistics, more confirmed targets than pilots twice her seniority, a perfect safety record, and the respect of her crew, even from the veterans who'd initially doubted her capabilities. This particular morning had started like most others at the forward operating base. Chen sat in the operations center reviewing flight schedules with her commanding officer, Colonel Marcus Richardson. The schedule was routine: patrol missions over designated zones, potential close air support if needed, but nothing that suggested an active combat scenario. The summer heat was oppressive, even inside the air-conditioned operations center. Chen nursed a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, listening half attentively as Richardson briefed her on a series of minor incidents that had occurred in the last 48 hours. Nothing serious, nothing that required her particular set of skills. She was scheduled for a routine 6-hour mission starting at 1400 hours, which meant she had several more hours to complete her pre-flight maintenance checks and grab some lunch. Then the radio crackled. The voice that came through was tense but controlled, Captain James Mitchell calling from a reconnaissance unit somewhere in the northern mountains. The initial message was professional. They were conducting routine operations. But then came the next transmission that made Chen's blood run cold. "We are under heavy attack. Enemy force estimated at 300 plus. We are pinned down in a valley. Immediate air support required. Ammunition critical." The operations center went silent. Chen watched as Colonel Richardson's face transformed from casual interest to combat readiness. Other officers moved with sudden urgency, immediately begin plotting the enemy position and calculating response times. The gravity of the situation was clear. This wasn't a minor skirmish or a small engagement. This was a major ambush with significant enemy force arrayed against American soldiers who were in genuine mortal danger. "We need air support wheels up in 5 minutes, Richardson said, his voice carrying the weight of command. He looked around the room, assessing his pilots. Chen saw the hesitation in the eyes of some of the younger pilots. They were competent, but this was a hot zone insertion into what was clearly a hostile and complex combat scenario. Before Richardson could assign the mission, Chen stood up. "I'll take it, sir," she said quietly, her voice steady and certain. Richardson met her eyes for a moment, then nodded. "Go, full weapons load, everything we've got. You'll have drone overwatch and satellite imagery. Get moving, Chen." That was all the authorization she needed. Chen didn't run. Running would indicate panic, would shake the confidence of her crew. Instead, she walked with purposeful determination toward the flight line, her mind already shifting through the complex calculations required for the mission. Distance to target, approximately 47 kilometers. Flight time, approximately 16 minutes at maximum cruise speed. Enemy force composition, unknown but described as significant. Friendlies in contact, 137 soldiers led by Captain Mitchell. Her tactical situation was remarkably clear in her mind despite the time pressure. She had roughly 20 minutes before those soldiers would be overrun, assuming Mitchell's ammunition estimates were accurate and the situation didn't deteriorate further. As she approached her helicopter, she could already see her crew scrambling to prepare. Her co-pilot, Major David Harrison, was performing his own pre-flight checks. Her weapons officer, Lieutenant Sarah Reeves, was already in the back of the aircraft, ensuring that the weapons systems were armed and ready. These were the people Chen trusted with her life, and more importantly, the people she would be trusting with the lives of 137 American soldiers. Harrison looked up as she approached, seeing the expression on Chen's face and immediately understanding the gravity of the situation. "Hot zone?" he asked. Chen nodded. "Friendlies in critical contact. Full load." Harrison didn't waste time with unnecessary questions. He simply accelerated his checklist, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this before. Chen climbed into the cockpit, her hands moving through the pre-flight sequence with automatic precision. The seat felt familiar, like slipping into a second skin. She'd logged over 2,800 hours in this aircraft, and her muscle memory knew every system, every lever, every button. But today felt different. Today, soldiers would die or live based on her performance. She thought briefly of the email she'd received that morning from her brother, who'd asked her about a promotion opportunity. She thought of her parents in California, who'd never quite understood why she'd chosen a military career. She thought of the handful of women pilots across the military who were counting on her to prove that they belonged in combat roles. And then she pushed all those thoughts aside, locking them away in a compartment of her mind that she'd learned to seal during her first combat deployment. "Systems check," she called out, and Harrison responded immediately, confirming each system as she tested it. The rotors began to spin, slowly at first, then accelerating to operational speed. The sound was familiar, a deep, rhythmic pulse that had become as natural to her as her own heartbeat. The flight control systems responded perfectly to her inputs. The weapons systems came online, all ordnance accounted for and ready. The targeting computer confirmed it was receiving data from the satellite systems. Everything was ready. Everything was optimized. Everything was prepared for combat. As Chen was completing her final checks, a ground crew member approached with a marker, asking if she wanted them to mark the helicopter with confirmed target counts. Chen shook her head. "Not today," she said. "Today we're just doing our job." But her jaw was set with determination. She could see in the eyes of her crew that they understood what was at stake. These weren't abstract numbers anymore. There were real soldiers down there, real people with families, with hopes, with dreams. And if Chen and her crew didn't perform flawlessly, those soldiers would die. Richardson appeared at the side of the helicopter, ensuring Chen had everything she needed. "You've got override authority on the radio net. Mitchell's expecting you. The satellite imagery shows the valley terrain is treacherous, but you'll have drone coverage giving you real-time updates. Any questions?" Chen looked at the colonel and shook her head. "No questions, sir. Just tell Mitchell we're coming and we're going to give him everything we've got." Richardson nodded, understanding what she meant. This wasn't just about dropping ordnance. This was about skill, precision, courage, and the willingness to put yourself in danger to save others. It was about the fundamental contract that soldiers made with each other, that you wouldn't abandon your brothers and sisters in arms. "You're cleared for immediate takeoff," Richardson said. "Good luck, Raven. Bring our people home." Chen's hands moved to the collective and cyclic controls. "Copy that, sir. Raven 1 departing for target area." She brought the helicopter up to hover altitude, the aircraft responding to her control inputs with perfect precision. As she lifted off from the flight line, Chen saw the ground crew watching her go, their faces reflecting the understanding that this was one of those moments that would define careers, save lives, or end in tragedy. There was no middle ground. There was only success or failure, and failure wasn't an option Chen was willing to contemplate. As the helicopter climbed higher and began accelerating toward the target zone, Chen locked her focus on the mission ahead. Somewhere in those mountains, Captain Mitchell and his soldiers were counting down their final minutes. She had one job: to reach them before it was too late. She pushed the throttle forward, accelerating the aircraft to maximum sustainable speed, feeling the aircraft respond beneath her skilled hands. The clock was ticking, and Raven was coming. The valley had transformed into a hellscape in the span of minutes. What had been a scenic mountain pass now resembled a World War I trench, with soldiers pressed against rocks, huddled behind disabled vehicles, and taking cover in whatever crevices the terrain offered. The smell of gunpowder, burning fuel, and blood hung thick in the air. Enemy fire continued to rake across the American positions with methodical intensity, as though the attackers were enjoying the devastation they were inflicting. Captain Mitchell moved between his soldiers, staying low, his face a mask of professional composure even as his mind raced with the grim mathematics of their situation. Private First Class Rodriguez was positioned near Mitchell, his young face streaked with sweat and dust. Rodriguez had only been with the unit for 4 months, and this was his first real combat experience. He'd proven capable during the initial firefight, maintaining discipline and delivering accurate covering fire, but now fear was beginning to creep into his eyes. Rodriguez glanced at Mitchell and held up his ammunition pouch. "Captain, I'm down to maybe 2 magazines left." "How much longer until air support arrives?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of survival. Mitchell wanted to tell him the truth, that air support was still 14 minutes away, maybe longer. He wanted to be honest about the fact that at current ammunition expenditure rates they'd be dry in less than 5 minutes. But instead he placed a reassuring hand on Rodriguez's shoulder and said, "Stay calm. We've got time. Air support is inbound. Just make your shots count." It wasn't really a lie. It was what soldiers called combat wisdom, telling your troops just enough truth mixed with just enough hope to keep them fighting rather than surrendering to despair. Sergeant Tom Parker moved through the position, checking on other soldiers, assessing their ammunition status and their mental state. Parker was skilled at reading soldiers. He could tell by the set of a man's jaw, by the tension in his shoulders, whether someone was close to breaking. As he made his rounds, Parker's expression grew increasingly grim. The ammunition counts were catastrophic. He found young Private James Chen, the radio operator, crouched behind a boulder, blood dripping from a gash on his forehead where a ricochet had caught him. "How much longer, Chen?" Parker asked urgently. Chen pressed his hand against the radio handset, listening intently, then looked up at the sergeant with desperation in his eyes. 8 minutes, Chen said, his voice cracking slightly. "She says 8 minutes, but Sergeant, that's a long time from now." Parker understood the unspoken math. At their current rate of fire, they had roughly 6 minutes of ammunition remaining. 8 minutes minus 6 minutes equaled a 2-minute window where their ability to defend themselves would be essentially non-existent. 2 minutes where they'd have to hope that the enemy ran low on ammunition, or made a tactical mistake, or decided the American positions were too costly to assault. 2 minutes that would feel like an eternity. Parker moved back to Mitchell and whispered the bad news. Mitchell's jaw clenched, but his expression remained resolute. The enemy assault intensified, as if the attackers sensed that their prey was weakening. A fresh barrage of mortar fire came in, the explosions walking across the American position. Shrapnel whined through the air with deadly velocity. A soldier named Corporal Williams cried out as fragment caught his arm, spinning him against the rock he was using for cover. Medic Sarah Johnson rushed toward him, moving in a crouch, her medical bag bouncing against her hip. She reached Williams and immediately assessed the wound, a deep laceration across his bicep with significant bleeding. Johnson applied a pressure bandage with practiced efficiency, her hands steady despite the chaos around them. "You're going to be okay," she told Williams, speaking with the confidence that made even wounded soldiers believe her. "The blood looks worse than it is. Keep applying pressure. Help's coming soon." Help, that word seemed to be all they had left. A machine gun nest positioned on the ridge above had been particularly effective at pinning down Mitchell's right flank. 2 soldiers in that sector had been wounded trying to suppress it. Mitchell made a tactical decision. He'd have to use what little ammunition remained to attempt to neutralize that threat. He called forward his best marksman, a lanky sergeant named David Martinez who'd been a competitive shooter before joining the military. Martinez understood the mission without needing detailed explanation. He had perhaps 3 magazines remaining, maybe 12 shots at critical targets. Mitchell gestured to the location of the machine gun nest, and Martinez nodded grimly. The sergeant positioned himself with clear sightlines to the enemy position, took a deep breath, and prepared for what might be his last chance to make his ammunition count. Martinez fired. The first shot caught the machine gunner high in the chest. The second shot struck the assistant gunner as he tried to reposition. The third shot took out another fighter moving to take over the weapon. The machine gun fire from that position ceased, and the American soldiers in that sector let out a ragged cheer. But the victory was bittersweet. Martinez was now completely out of ammunition, and 2 other soldiers near him were running dangerously low. Lieutenant David Torres moved through the center of the position, coordinating fire and managing the limited resources they had left. Torres was a West Point graduate, the kind of officer who'd chosen the military because he believed in something bigger than himself. Now he was facing the awful possibility that his belief might not be enough to save his soldiers. Torres found Mitchell and reported the situation. "Captain, we're approaching critical ammunition levels." At current burn rate, we'll have effective fire for maybe 4 more minutes. Mitchell's eyes locked with Tor's. Chen said 8 minutes. I know, sir, Tor's replied quietly. We're going to have a 4-minute gap. The two officers stood silently for a moment, each understanding the implications. 4 minutes was an eternity in combat. 4 minutes was long enough for the enemy to launch a successful assault. 4 minutes was long enough to lose everything. Mitchell keyed his radio and connected with Chen again. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, but it carried an edge of desperation that not even years of training could completely mask. Raven 1, this is command. We have a critical situation. Enemy assault pressure is increasing. We're estimating we'll be at 0 effective ammunition in approximately 4 minutes. Your ETA is 8 minutes. That gives us a 4-minute gap where we'll be defenseless. Request you accelerate if possible. There was a pause, just a brief moment of static, and then Chen's voice came back, clearer and more determined than before. Copy that, command. I'm pushing this bird to maximum sustainable speed. I'll shave 2 minutes off ETA if I can, but I need to tell you something. You need to hold for those 4 minutes. You need to find a way, because I'm coming and I'm bringing everything this aircraft can deliver. When I arrive, the tide turns. You hold those 4 minutes and you'll see tomorrow. That's a promise. Something in Chen's voice, the absolute certainty, the confidence, the unwavering commitment, seemed to reinvigorate Mitchell's soldiers. Word spread through the positions. The pilot was pushing her helicopter to the limit. The pilot was coming. And not just any pilot, but one who sounded like she genuinely believed she could change the outcome of this battle. Mitchell made an announcement over the radio net. All units, listen up. We have 4 minutes to hold this position with what ammunition we have left. After that, we hold based on superior training, superior discipline, and the knowledge that air support is seconds away. The pilot inbound is the best in the business. When she arrives, this ambush ends. Until then, make every shot count. Make every round meaningful. No wasted fire. No panic. We are American soldiers. We hold this ground. The soldiers in the valley huddled behind their cover, checking their remaining ammunition, checking their weapons, preparing for the most difficult 4 minutes of their lives. The enemy fire continued, but something had shifted. The Americans weren't fighting for victory anymore. They were fighting for survival. They were fighting to make it to the next 4 minutes. They were fighting because a pilot named Sarah Chen had told them they would make it, and they were willing to stake their lives on her word. The countdown continued. 4 minutes until ammunition ran out. 4 minutes until they would be vulnerable. 4 minutes until everything would be decided. Major Sarah Chen's hands gripped the collective and cyclic controls with the kind of tension that only came when everything was on the line. The attack helicopter, a massive, powerful machine bristling with weapons, surged forward at maximum sustainable speed, pushing through the thin mountain air at just over 150 knots. Beneath her, the rugged terrain blurred into a patchwork of browns and greens as she navigated the mountain passes with the kind of precision that only years of training could provide. The rotors overhead beat a steady, rhythmic pulse that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat, but today that sound carried the weight of urgency. "Satellite relay coming through now," called out Major David Harrison from the right seat, his voice steady and professional despite the intensity of the moment. "Getting target imagery. Stand by." The co-pilot's experienced hands moved across the control panels, processing real-time data from satellites orbiting overhead. The information they were receiving painted a picture that was far more dire than Mitchell's initial radio report had suggested. "Enemy force concentration is massive," Harrison continued, his tone shifting to reflect the gravity of what he was seeing. "Initial count suggests at least 200 to 300 combatants spread across the ridgelines. They've got this valley completely locked down. There are fortified positions. Looks like they've been digging in for a while. This wasn't just a random ambush, Major. This was organized, planned, and well executed." In the back of the helicopter, Lieutenant Sarah Reeves manned the weapons systems. She'd already run through her combat checklist 3 times, verifying that every weapon was armed, every targeting system was functional, and every round of ammunition was accounted for. Reeves was a weapons officer of legendary skill. She could calculate firing solutions in her head faster than most people could operate a calculator. Now she was reviewing the targeting data that was being transmitted directly to her console, her fingers dancing across the controls to prepare for the combat scenario that was rapidly approaching. All weapon systems nominal, Reeves reported. Rocket pods armed. Gun systems armed. Targeting computer is receiving satellite data streams. Major Chen, when you give me the word, I can deliver ordnance on target with absolute precision. Chen processed the information being fed to her from multiple sources. The mental picture was becoming increasingly clear and increasingly terrifying. She had approximately 137 American soldiers trapped in an indefensible position against an enemy force that outnumbered them by more than 2-to-1. She had a 4-minute window where those soldiers would be without ammunition, essentially defenseless against a determined assault. And she was still 6 minutes away from the target zone, pushing her helicopter and her own skills to dangerous limits. Flight operations, this is Raven 1, Chen radioed, her voice cutting through the static with crystal clarity. Confirming updated ETA to target is 6 minutes. Current speed is maximum sustainable. I'll be there with all weapons hot. Copy that, Raven 1, came the response from the Flight Operations Center, where Colonel Richardson was monitoring her progress. You're clear for combat operations. No friendlies in your danger zone. Weapons free. Repeat, weapons are free. Chen banked hard left to navigate through a particularly treacherous mountain pass. The helicopter responded to her control inputs with the kind of precision that came from perfect synchronization between pilot and machine. She'd practiced this maneuver hundreds of times, but today it felt different. Today, the margin for error was zero. Any miscalculation, any hesitation, any mistake would result in either her helicopter crashing into a mountainside or arriving too late to prevent a massacre. The G-forces from the banking maneuver pressed against her body, and Chen felt the familiar sensation of combat operations settling over her like a second skin. Her breathing steadied. Her heart rate, which had spiked when she first received Mitchell's distress call, regulated to a manageable level. Her mind shifted into the hyper-focused state that combat demanded. Everything else, her doubts, her fears, her awareness of her own mortality, got locked away in compartments of her consciousness. What remained was pure pilot, pure warrior, pure focus. Drone feeds showing real-time enemy positions, Harrison announced, his eyes tracking the stream of data flowing across his screen. We've got visual on 4 primary machine gun nests, at least 6 mortar positions. Enemy fighters are concentrated on the ridgelines and in defensive positions among the rocks. The American unit is pinned down in the valley center, using boulders and disabled vehicles for cover. Chen visualized the tactical map in her mind. She understood the geometry of the battlefield. She understood where she needed to position her helicopter to maximize her weapon's effectiveness while minimizing the risk to the American soldiers below. She understood the firing solutions that would be required, and she understood that she had roughly 4 minutes to completely reorganize the battlefield and shift the tactical situation in favor of the Americans. How much time until ammunition runs critical for Mitchell's unit? Chen asked, her voice calm but carrying an undertone of urgency. There was a brief pause while Harrison calculated. Based on their last ammunition report and estimated burn rate, approximately 3 minutes until they run dry. You've got a 3-minute window where they'll be effectively defenseless. 3 minutes. Chen's mind raced through the implications. She was 6 minutes away. That meant 3 minutes of pure defensive chaos for Mitchell's soldiers, 3 minutes where they'd have to rely on training, discipline, and luck to stay alive against an enemy force that massively outnumbered them. 3 minutes was a long time in combat. 3 minutes could feel like an hour. 3 minutes could change everything. Chen made a decision. She pushed the collective control slightly higher, increasing the helicopter's angle of attack and extracting more power from the turbines. The aircraft responded, climbing slightly and accelerating further. The airframe shuddered slightly under the increased stress. She was pushing beyond recommended operational parameters, dancing right at the edge of what the aircraft was designed to handle. Harrison glanced over at her, recognizing immediately what she was doing. "You're redlining this bird," he said, not critically but simply stating fact. "I know," Chen replied. "Shave 2 more minutes. I need to get there before they run out of ammunition." "That's dangerous, Major," Reeves called from the back, her weapons officer's voice carrying genuine concern. "Push it too hard and we could experience mechanical failure." "Understood," Chen responded. "But those soldiers need us now, not in 5 minutes. We're going to make this work." The helicopter thundered through the mountain pass, every system pushed to its operational limits. The temperature gauge for the turbine was climbing into the yellow zone. The rotor RPM was at maximum. The airframe was vibrating slightly from the strain, but the airspeed indicator was showing improvement. She was making time. Chen keyed her radio. "Raven 1 to command. Revised ETA is 4 minutes. I'm pushing this aircraft to maximum capacity. When I arrive, I want you to be ready to mark enemy positions. The moment I'm in firing position, you give me everything you've got." Mitchell's response came back immediately. "Copy that, Raven 1. We'll mark targets. We're down to our final minutes of effective fire. Thank you for coming." The simple gratitude in Mitchell's voice affected Chen more deeply than she expected. These weren't abstract soldiers anymore. They were real people, real warriors, real human beings who were trusting her with their lives. The weight of that responsibility was enormous, but it was also clarifying. It was also purpose. The mountain passes gave way to wider terrain as Chen approached the target zone. The valley where Mitchell's unit was trapped came into visual range. Even from this distance, Chen could see the muzzle flashes of enemy weapons, the dust from explosions, the visual evidence of intense combat. The enemy force was large, larger than she'd anticipated even with the satellite imagery. She could see enemy fighters scattered across the ridgelines, positioned in carefully chosen defensive locations. 4 minutes to target, Chen announced. "All units prepare for aggressive combat operations. This ends now." She descended slightly, positioning her helicopter for the optimal firing approach. Behind her, Reeves was already running final targeting calculations. Beside her, Harrison was confirming that all systems were ready. And somewhere below, 137 American soldiers were preparing for the final moments of their defense before air support arrived. Chen felt a strange calm settle over her. This was what she'd trained for. This was what she'd sacrificed for. This was the moment where her years of service, her dedication, her willingness to push boundaries and prove herself, all came together. The countdown was ending. The attack was about to begin. The moment Major Sarah Chen cleared the final ridge and the valley spread out beneath her, time seemed to compress into a single, crystalline moment of perfect clarity. Below her, the battle was in full chaos. Muzzle flashes flickered like fireflies across the ridgelines. Dust clouds rose from where enemy mortars were impacting. And in the center of it all, behind boulders and disabled vehicles, she could see the small cluster of American soldiers. The 137 lives that depended entirely on her next actions. "I have visual on the target," Chen announced, her voice steady and focused. "Marking primary threat. Rocket Pod 1 is hot. Weapons officer confirmed targeting." "All systems nominal," Reeves responded from the weapons station. "I've got the machine gun nest on the North Ridge locked in, ready to deliver on your command." Chen made the critical decision to engage from west to east, approaching the valley from an angle that would give her optimal firing position, while keeping her helicopter from drifting into the effective range of ground fire. She banked slightly, bringing the aircraft into position. Below, she could see the exact location of the primary machine gun nest that had been so effective at pinning down Mitchell's soldiers. The weapon was well positioned among rocks, with excellent fields of fire and concealed from direct approach. Not concealed from above. "Firing," Chen called out, her hands steady on the controls as she made the final adjustments to her approach vector. The first Hellfire missile released with a distinctive whoosh, the aircraft bucking slightly as the weapon left the launch rail. Chen watched the missile streak toward its target, a blur of motion that resolved into a devastating impact. The explosion engulfed the machine gun nest, the blast so powerful it obliterated the carefully constructed defensive position. Enemy fighters in the immediate vicinity were tossed like dolls, their bodies crumpling as the concussive force of the explosion overwhelmed them. In the valley below, Captain Mitchell heard the explosion and for a moment thought it was enemy mortar fire. Then he heard it, the distinctive sound of an attack helicopter, the rotors beating the air in a way no fixed-wing aircraft could replicate. When he looked up and saw the aircraft, a surge of emotion threatened to overwhelm him. Relief, hope, gratitude, the most beautiful machine he'd ever seen, bristling with weapons and flown by a pilot who was about to change everything. "Raven 1 is here," Mitchell broadcast over the radio net, his voice now carrying hope instead of desperation. "All units prepare to support airstrikes. Mark enemy positions when you have them." Chen was already banking for her second approach. The first successful strike had announced her arrival to everyone in the valley, both American soldiers and enemy fighters. The enemy response was immediate. Automatic weapons fire raked across the sky, trying to track the helicopter. Chen felt the helicopter shudder slightly as rounds impacted the airframe, but the damage was superficial. The aircraft was built to take punishment. "We've got incoming fire," Harrison reported calmly, taking rounds on the fuselage. "No critical systems impacted. We're good to continue." Chen didn't respond verbally. Instead, she adjusted her flight path, diving lower to get a better firing angle on the secondary target, a mortar position that had been systematically pounding Mitchell's location. She could see the enemy mortar crew working frantically to relocate as they realized air support had arrived. It was too late. "Gun run," Chen announced, shifting from missiles to the rotary cannon. Her hands moved with practiced precision as she lined up the firing solution. The hydraulic systems responded to her inputs, rotating the gun turret to the optimal angle, and then she squeezed the trigger. The rotary cannon erupted in a thunderous roar, thousands of rounds per minute tearing through the air. The 20mm rounds were specifically designed to penetrate armor and shred personnel. They did their job with horrifying efficiency. The mortar position disappeared in a cloud of dust and fragments. Bodies and equipment were scattered across the mountainside. The rate of fire from that position, which had been relentless just moments before, simply ceased to exist. Mitchell watched the strikes from below, and despite the ongoing danger, he felt a grim satisfaction. The pilot wasn't just delivering ordnance. She was doing it with precision that suggested complete mastery of her aircraft and her weapons. Each strike was calculated, efficient, devastating. This wasn't random bombing. This was surgical warfare. Chen banked hard again, pulling 4GS as she maneuvered for her third attack run. The helicopter groaned slightly under the strain, but it held. She was targeting the enemy's command position, a cluster of leaders who were clearly coordinating the overall assault. Taking out the command structure would disrupt the enemy's ability to execute coordinated attacks. "Third target locked," Reeves called out. "Rocket Pod 2 is ready. I have the command position in the gun sight." "Fire," Chen commanded. The second Hellfire missile screamed away, following a ballistic arc that curved toward the enemy command position. Chen watched as it impacted, and the explosion was perhaps even more violent than the first, sending a plume of smoke and debris hundreds of feet into the air. When the smoke cleared, the command position was simply gone, obliterated, neutralized, removed from the battle entirely. The psychological impact on the enemy force was immediate and devastating. The coordinated assault that had been so relentless just minutes before began to falter. Enemy fighters were no longer advancing. They were taking cover. They were thinking about survival rather than victory. The tide of battle had shifted with remarkable speed. Chen executed another gun run, this time targeting a cluster of enemy fighters who were attempting to reorganize their assault. The cannon fire was precise, devastating, and utterly demoralizing to an enemy force that had been so confident just minutes before. Chen could see enemy fighters breaking and running, abandoning their positions and attempting to retreat down the mountainside. "They're breaking," Mitchell shouted, his voice carrying triumph. "The enemy is pulling back. All units maintain defensive positions. Continue marking targets for Raven 1. But Chen wasn't finished. She made 3 more attack runs, each one targeting remaining enemy strongpoints, mortar positions, and clusters of fighters attempting to establish new defensive positions. With each pass, she demonstrated a level of skill that left her crew awed. Reeves was calling out targeting solutions with increasing confidence, knowing that Chen would execute them perfectly. Harrison was managing systems and tracking new threats with practiced efficiency. By the time Chen completed her 6th attack run, the enemy assault had effectively collapsed. The coordinated ambush that had trapped 137 American soldiers had transformed into a chaotic retreat. Enemy fighters were fleeing down the mountainside, abandoning equipment, weapons, and their fallen comrades. The organized force that had outnumbered the Americans by more than 2 to 1 was now in complete disarray. "Raven 1 to all units," Chen radioed, her voice calm and professional despite the intensity of what she'd just accomplished. "Enemy force is breaking. Pursuing elements are retreating down the eastern slope. Recommend consolidating your position and preparing for potential counterattack." "Copy that, Raven 1, Mitchell responded, his voice thick with emotion. "Outstanding work. You've turned this entire battle. Hold on station while we secure the area." Chen banked the helicopter into a protective orbit above the valley, her weapons still ready, her vigilance undiminished. Below, Mitchell's soldiers were emerging cautiously from their defensive positions, their faces showing the shock and gratitude of soldiers who'd literally been minutes away from being overrun, and were now alive because of one pilot's skill and courage. In the operations center back at the base, Colonel Richardson watched the real-time imagery coming from the satellite feed. He saw the enemy force scattering, saw the American soldiers consolidating their positions, saw the tide of battle transform in less than 10 minutes of combat. He turned to his staff and said simply, "That's why she's the best pilot in this command." The battle wasn't over. There would still be mop-up operations, still the threat of enemy counterattack, still the medical evacuations that needed to happen. But the critical moment had passed. The massacre that had seemed inevitable just minutes before had been prevented by one helicopter pilot's extraordinary skill under impossible pressure. Chen remained on station, watching, waiting, ready to unleash destruction on any enemy force that attempted to reorganize. Her hands remained steady on the controls. Her focus remained absolute. And somewhere below her, 137 American soldiers were alive because she had refused to accept failure as an option. The transformation was stunning in its completeness. What had been an overwhelming, coordinated assault just minutes before had become a rout, a chaotic scramble of enemy fighters attempting to escape the devastation being delivered from above. The enemy force that had so meticulously planned this ambush, that had positioned themselves with such care and discipline, was now simply falling apart. Discipline gave way to panic. Organization gave way to survival instinct. The careful tactical advantage they'd held evaporated the moment Chen's first weapons came online. Captain Mitchell watched from his position as enemy fighters abandoned their carefully prepared defensive positions and began fleeing down the eastern slope of the mountain. Some were moving with tactical awareness, attempting to maintain some semblance of organized retreat. Others were simply running, abandoning weapons and equipment in their desperation to get away from the helicopter that was raining death from the sky. Mitchell felt a surge of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel minutes before, genuine hope that they might all survive this. "Cease firing and consolidate positions," Mitchell ordered, his voice now carrying authority instead of desperation. "All units, secure your sectors and hold defensive positions. We're not out of the woods yet. Be prepared for counterattack." But as he surveyed the battlefield, Mitchell understood with surprising clarity that there wouldn't be an organized counterattack. Not today. The enemy force had lost its coherence, its leadership, and most importantly, its will to continue the engagement. They'd come confident, certain of victory, and in the span of 6 devastating minutes, everything had changed. Sergeant Tom Parker emerged from behind his position, his face streaked with sweat and dust, his weapon still ready. When he locked eyes with Mitchell, a complex emotion passed between them, acknowledgement of how close they'd come to annihilation, gratitude for the pilot who'd arrived just in time, and the grim understanding that they'd won only the battle, not necessarily the war. Parker moved quickly through the position, checking on soldiers, assessing injuries, and beginning to organize the survivors. The full scope of the casualties became apparent as soldiers began emerging cautiously from their defensive positions. Of the 137 soldiers who'd entered that valley that morning, 3 were confirmed killed in action. 17 more had sustained wounds ranging from minor lacerations to serious trauma. But the crucial difference was that they were alive. They would go home. They would see their families again. The alternative, complete annihilation, had been prevented by Major Sarah Chen's arrival and extraordinary combat performance. Medic Sarah Johnson began moving between the wounded with renewed energy, now that the immediate danger had passed. Her earlier emergency field medicine transitioned into more comprehensive care. She coordinated with the other medics in the unit, triaging the wounded by severity of injury, ensuring that the soldiers requiring the most critical care received it first. Private First Class Rodriguez, who'd been so afraid just minutes before, was helping Johnson organize the medical supplies and prepare the wounded for evacuation. "Raven 1, this is command," Mitchell called on the radio, his voice now carrying profound gratitude. "We're consolidating positions. Enemy force has broken and is retreating down the eastern slope. We have 3 KIA and 17 WIA. Request immediate medevac for priority casualties." "Copy that command," Chen responded, her voice still steady and professional from her position above the valley. "I'm maintaining overwatch. Secondary medevac birds are en route. ETA is approximately 8 minutes. Confirm no friendly forces in the eastern approach corridor." "Confirmed," Mitchell replied. "Eastern corridor is clear of friendlies. You're free to engage any enemy activity in that zone." As if to punctuate the point, a cluster of enemy fighters who were attempting to reorganize on a ridgeline about a kilometer east of the main valley became the target of Chen's continued vigilance. She spotted the movement and immediately repositioned her helicopter to get optimal firing angles. One quick gun run dispersed them, sending them scattering in panic. The message was clear. Anyone who attempted to reorganize, anyone who attempted to continue this fight, would face the wrath of the helicopter that dominated the airspace above the valley. The reality of what had happened was beginning to sink into the minds of Mitchell's soldiers. They'd been minutes, literally minutes away from being completely overrun. They'd been running out of ammunition. They'd been preparing for what might have been their final stand. And then a helicopter had appeared, and one pilot had single-handedly turned the entire engagement around. The psychological impact of that knowledge was almost as significant as the tactical impact. Private James Chen, the young radio operator whose name coincidentally matched the helicopter pilot's last name, was working to establish communication with the medevac helicopters that were being dispatched. His voice, which had been strained with fear just minutes before, now carried the steady professionalism of a soldier who'd survived his first major combat engagement. He was processing the experience, understanding at a level deeper than any training could provide, what it meant to face death and find salvation at the last possible moment. Lieutenant David Torres was moving through the position, checking on his squad leaders, getting reports on ammunition status, casualty status, and morale. The news was uniformly positive in ways that had seemed impossible just 30 minutes before. Yes, they'd suffered casualties. Yes, they'd depleted most of their ammunition, but they were alive. They were intact as a unit. They would stand and fight another day if necessary, but hopefully they wouldn't have to. Major Chen remained on station overhead, her helicopter circling in a protective pattern above the valley. She'd expended nearly half of her ordnance in the initial engagement, but she still had significant firepower remaining. She was monitoring multiple radio frequencies, staying in contact with Mitchell below, with the approaching medevac helicopters, and with her base operations center. Her eyes continuously scanned the ridgelines and valleys around her, alert for any sign of renewed enemy activity or threats. "Any sign of secondary threats?" she asked Harrison, her co-pilot. "Negative," Harrison replied, his eyes tracking the targeting radar. "Satellite imagery shows enemy retreating in disorganized fashion. No indication of counterattack preparation. Primary threat appears neutralized." The first medevac helicopter appeared on the horizon about 6 minutes later, its distinctive shape unmistakable against the sky. Behind it came a second medevac bird, and most importantly, a full transport helicopter carrying reinforcements and supplies. Chen coordinated with the incoming aircraft, providing them with real-time situational awareness and continuing to maintain overwatch as the medevac operation began. She positioned her attack helicopter to provide maximum protective coverage, ready to respond instantly if any enemy activity threatened the vulnerable transport aircraft. Mitchell personally coordinated with the medevac crews, directing them to the location where his 3 most critically wounded soldiers had been prepared for immediate evacuation. The scene was one of controlled urgency, soldiers carefully loading their wounded comrades onto stretchers, medics providing final updates to the medevac personnel, and everyone working with the understanding that speed could literally mean the difference between survival and death for the wounded. As the stretchers were being loaded, Mitchell made a point of personally checking on each of his wounded soldiers, placing a hand on their shoulders, meeting their eyes, and telling them they would be okay. It was a simple gesture, but it carried the weight of their survival and the knowledge that they'd all made it through together. When he reached Private Williams, the soldier whose arm had been torn open by shrapnel, Mitchell leaned in close and said, "You fought hard today, Williams. You made your unit proud. You're going to recover, and you're going to heal." Williams, his arm bandaged and his face pale from blood loss, managed a weak smile. "We made it, Captain. I didn't think we would, but we made it." "We did," Mitchell agreed. "And that's because we held our ground and because we had a guardian angel in the sky." As the medevac helicopters lifted off, their rotors beating the air as they rose above the valley, Chen provided continuous protection, her weapons systems tracking any potential threat. The transport helicopter landed in a cleared area, disgorging soldiers with additional ammunition, supplies, and reinforcements for Mitchell's unit. Mitchell stood in the center of the valley and took stock of his unit. They were bloodied but unbowed. They were wounded but surviving. They were traumatized but intact. And they were alive because one pilot had the skill, the courage, and the determination to do what no one else could have done in that moment. "Raven 1 command," Mitchell radioed, his voice carrying profound emotion. "Thank you for everything. You saved every single one of us down here." There was a brief pause, and then Chen's response came back, her voice steady and professional but with something new in it. The understanding that she'd made a genuine difference, that she'd changed the course of history for 137 soldiers and their families. "Copy that, command. Raven 1 is honored to support American soldiers. I'll stay on station as long as fuel allows. You hold that ground. Reinforcements are being mobilized." The situation is turning in our favor." And as Mitchell looked at his soldiers, some treating wounds, some consolidating positions, some staring off into the distance processing what they'd survived, he understood that Chen's statement was absolutely accurate. They would hold that ground, because they were soldiers, because they'd already proven they could survive the unsurvivable, and because somewhere above them a helicopter pilot was proving that no American soldier would be abandoned while she had fuel in her tanks and ammunition in her weapons. The valley had become a place of life instead of death, and they owed it all to the skill, bravery, and determination of one extraordinary pilot. The sun was beginning to descend toward the western horizon when the reality of what had transpired truly began to sink into the minds of Mitchell's soldiers. The immediate crisis had passed. The enemy had retreated into the mountains, scattered and disorganized, leaving behind a trail of bodies, abandoned weapons, and evidence of their devastating defeat. The medevac helicopters had extracted the 3 soldiers who'd been killed in action: Specialist Marcus Coleman, Private First Class Robert Hernandez, and Sergeant Anthony DiMarco, along with the 17 wounded soldiers requiring immediate medical attention. The living had been separated from the dead, and the brutal arithmetic of combat had been calculated. They'd lost 4% of their fighting force but saved 96%. Captain Mitchell sat on a flat rock near the center of the valley, his back against the stone, his weapon resting across his lap. His hands were trembling slightly, not from fear anymore, but from the massive adrenaline crash that came after hours of combat stress. Around him, his soldiers were processing the experience in their own ways. Some were checking weapons, maintaining tactical discipline even though the immediate threat had passed. Others were sitting quietly, staring into the distance, their minds still partially locked in the combat that had consumed the last few hours. A few were openly weeping, not from pain, but from the emotional release that came from knowing they would live to see another day. Private First Class Rodriguez approached Mitchell and sat down heavily beside him. The young soldier looked like he'd aged years in the span of hours. His face was gaunt, his eyes haunted by the knowledge of how close he'd come to death. "Captain, we made it," Rodriguez said quietly, his voice hoarse from shouting orders and screaming during the engagement. "I didn't think we would, but we actually made it." Mitchell placed a hand on the young private's shoulder. "We made it because you fought hard, because every soldier in this valley maintained discipline and held their position, and because we had the best pilot in the entire military command structure providing air support." Mitchell's voice carried absolute certainty about that last part. He'd seen combat before, had worked with air support on previous deployments, but he'd never witnessed anything quite like what Major Sarah Chen had accomplished. Medic Sarah Johnson was working with her medical team to assess the overall health status of the unit. While the most critical casualties had been evacuated, many soldiers had minor to moderate injuries that needed treatment. Johnson moved methodically through the unit, treating wounds, applying fresh bandages, administering pain medication where appropriate. As she worked, she found herself replaying the moments when she'd thought they might not make it, when the enemy assault had seemed unstoppable, when death had seemed more likely than survival. Now, moving among her soldiers, providing care instead of emergency triage, she felt the profound relief of someone who'd looked into the abyss and managed to pull back from the edge. Up in the sky, Major Sarah Chen remained on station, her helicopter continuing its protective orbit above the valley. Her fuel status was becoming a concern. She'd pushed hard to get there, burned significant ordnance in the engagement, and now had perhaps another 90 minutes of flight time before she'd need to return to base. But she wasn't going anywhere until she was confident that her soldiers were secure. That was the implicit contract between pilot and ground unit. You didn't abandon your people just because the immediate crisis had passed. "How are we looking on fuel?" Chen asked Harrison, keeping her eyes on the valley below. 98 minutes to critical reserve, Harrison confirmed. "We can stay another hour without pushing it too hard, then we need to head back." "Roger that," Chen acknowledged. Keep monitoring for any enemy activity. I want to make absolutely sure they're not regrouping for a secondary assault." In the operations center back at the base, Colonel Richardson was reviewing preliminary battle reports with his staff. The scale of what had occurred was becoming increasingly clear. A 137-soldier reconnaissance unit had been ambushed by a force estimated at between 250 and 350 enemy combatants. The enemy had achieved tactical surprise and initial numerical superiority. Every conventional military assessment suggested the American unit should have been overrun. Instead, they'd not only survived but inflicted devastating losses on the enemy force while maintaining unit cohesion and morale. The difference was one pilot. "Get me a detailed account of Major Chen's actions," Richardson ordered his intelligence officer. "Everything from the moment she took off to the moment she completed her final attack run. I want every weapon system analyzed, every targeting solution reviewed. I want to understand exactly what she did and how she did it." The intelligence officer nodded and immediately began pulling together the preliminary data. What was becoming clear from the satellite imagery and drone footage was that Chen had demonstrated extraordinary tactical skill. Her approach vectors had been calculated to minimize exposure to ground fire while maximizing weapons effectiveness. Her firing solutions had been precise, surgical, devastating. She hadn't wasted ammunition or delivered blanket fire hopping to hit something. Every round, every missile, every weapon deployment had been targeted toward a specific objective, eliminating enemy capability, reducing enemy morale, turning the tide of battle. As dusk settled over the valley, Lieutenant David Torres organized the soldiers into a secure perimeter. Additional reinforcements were being mobilized. Another company would arrive within a few hours, along with additional supplies and support elements. The immediate tactical situation had transformed from desperate to manageable to secure. The soldiers who'd been minutes away from annihilation were now part of a consolidated defensive position with reinforcements en route. Torres found Mitchell and sat down beside him. "How are you holding up, Captain?" Torres asked, his own voice showing the strain of the day's events. "Better than I have any right to," Mitchell replied. "We lost 4 soldiers. That's 4 families that are going to receive notifications they never wanted to receive. But we could have lost all 137. We could have been completely annihilated." Mitchell paused, looking up at the sky where Chen's helicopter continued to circle. "One pilot changed all of that. One person's skill and bravery saved our entire unit." Torres nodded slowly. He'd been watching Chen's attack runs from his position, had seen the precision with which she'd engaged the enemy, had understood at a visceral level that they were witnessing something extraordinary. "She's legendary," Torres said quietly. "Whatever else happens in her career, this moment is already legendary." As the night deepened, Chen made radio contact with Mitchell one final time before she'd need to return to base. "Command, this is Raven 1. My fuel status is approaching critical. I'm going to head back to base now. Reinforcements are confirmed inbound. They'll be with you within 2 hours. You've got control of the situation. Outstanding work holding that position." Mitchell's response was immediate and carried the weight of genuine gratitude. "Raven 1, thank you for everything. You are the reason we're all still alive. We won't forget what you did today." "Just doing my job," Chen replied, her voice professional but with something underlying it, the understanding that today had been something far more significant than just doing her job. "You hold that ground, Command. You've earned it." As Chen's helicopter banked away from the valley and began the journey back to base, Mitchell watched it disappear into the darkness. Beside him, Rodriguez was also watching. The young private looked at his captain and said, "She saved us, didn't she? She literally saved our entire unit." "Yes," Mitchell agreed simply, "she did." Back at the base, Chen went through the formal debriefing process. Colonel Richardson personally interviewed her, wanting to hear firsthand her assessment of the battle, her tactical decisions, and her perspective on the engagement. Chen described the situation calmly and professionally, explaining her approach vectors, her targeting priorities, and the rationale behind each decision. What became clear was that she hadn't simply reacted to the situation. She'd analyzed it, understood it, and systematically dismantled the enemy's capability with calculated precision. "How did you know what to target first?" Richardson asked. "Experience," Chen replied. "I've worked enough combat operations to understand the hierarchy of threats. Machine gun nests create the highest casualty rate for ground forces. Mortar positions provide sustained indirect fire. Command structures coordinate the overall assault. If you eliminate those three elements, you disrupt the enemy's ability to execute coordinated attacks. The rest becomes rout and retreat." Richardson nodded slowly. "You performed at a level of excellence today that I've rarely witnessed. You saved 137 lives, Major. That's not just doing your job, that's being exceptional." As the night progressed, the story began spreading through the base. A female combat pilot had single-handedly prevented a massacre. She demonstrated tactical mastery, weapon system proficiency, and extraordinary courage under impossible pressure. By morning, everyone on the base would know the name Major Sarah Raven Chen. By the end of the week, senior command would be reviewing her actions. By the end of the month, her story would begin spreading through military circles and eventually to the broader public. But for now, in the quiet of the night, Chen sat in the operations center reviewing the day's events. She thought about the 137 soldiers she'd never met. She thought about the 4 soldiers who hadn't made it. She thought about the 17 who'd been wounded. And she thought about the brief radio exchanges she'd had with Captain Mitchell, the ground commander who trusted her completely despite never having worked with her before. Mitchell was still awake in the valley, sitting with his soldiers, counting the minutes until dawn and reinforcements arrived. He was reflecting on the moment when he'd thought all was lost, when he'd realized they had only minutes of ammunition remaining, when he'd believed that the end was imminent. And he was reflecting on the sound of helicopter rotors and the distinctive voice of a pilot named Sarah Chen telling him that help had arrived and that they would survive. In the darkness, looking up at the stars, Mitchell made a silent promise that he would never forget the name of the pilot who'd saved his unit. Major Sarah Raven Chen had earned her place in their history, in their hearts, and in the long tradition of American military heroes who'd put themselves in danger to save others. The battle was over. The real story, the one that would be told and retold, analyzed and studied, was just beginning. 3 weeks had passed since the battle in the valley. Captain James Mitchell sat in the small dining facility at the forward operating base, waiting. He wore his dress uniform, a formality that felt both appropriate and somewhat uncomfortable given the informal nature of what he was about to do. Across from him, Major Sarah Raven Chen entered the dining facility. She was also in dress uniform, her pilot's flight suit having been replaced with the formal military attire that was required for official functions. When their eyes met, something profound passed between them, a recognition that transcended military rank, that was beyond the formal protocols of military interaction. These 2 soldiers had never stood beside each other on the ground, had never shared a foxhole or taken cover behind the same boulder, but they had saved each other's life. They had shared a moment of genuine peril where the margin between life and death had measured in minutes. That kind of bond couldn't be created in any other way. "Major," Mitchell said, standing and extending his hand. Chen took it firmly, and they shook with the mutual respect that only soldiers who'd faced death together could truly understand. They sat, and for a moment neither spoke. The noise of the dining facility continued around them, soldiers eating, talking, laughing, but their small corner felt strangely quiet and intimate. "Thank you," Mitchell said finally, his voice carrying emotion he wasn't bothering to hide. "I've tried to find the right words for 3 weeks, and honestly, I can't find anything adequate. You gave us tomorrow. You gave 137 families the opportunity to have their loved ones come home." Chen looked down at her coffee cup, uncomfortable with the praise but understanding that Mitchell needed to express his gratitude. "I just did my job," she said quietly, but Mitchell shook his head firmly. "No," he said, "you did something far beyond your job. You exceeded every possible standard. You flew a helicopter at dangerous speeds through treacherous terrain. You executed combat operations with a precision that I've never witnessed before. And you did it all while maintaining absolute focus on the mission and the lives you were protecting. That's not just doing your job, that's being extraordinary." Chen looked up and met Mitchell's eyes. "You held that position. You and your soldiers, you could have broken, could have surrendered, could have given up when you realized you were almost out of ammunition. But you didn't. You held your ground. You maintained discipline. You gave me the time I needed to get there. That's extraordinary too." They sat in silence for a moment, two warriors who understood at a fundamental level what the other had accomplished and what it had cost. The weight of responsibility, the fear that had to be controlled, the decisions that had to be made when every choice seemed to lead toward death. They'd both experienced it, though in very different ways and from very different positions. "The story's getting out," Mitchell said after a while. "It's spreading through military circles. People are talking about what happened. Some of the soldiers who were there have been contacted by journalists. I don't know how long it will stay quiet, but I know the day is coming when this becomes a public story." Chen nodded slowly. She'd already been getting subtle indications that her actions were drawing attention. Colonel Richardson had been increasingly formal in his interactions with her. There had been visits from senior command officers who wanted to understand exactly what had happened. The preliminary investigation into the battle had been thorough, detailed, and clearly significant. "I'm not ready to be a symbol," Chen said quietly, her voice carrying vulnerability that she rarely allowed to show. "I'm just a pilot who did her job." "You're ready or not, you're going to be," Mitchell replied gently. "And that's not a bad thing, because you are a symbol of what's possible, of what women can achieve, of what one person's courage and skill can accomplish. Some people will focus on your gender because they're not ready to accept women in combat roles. Others will focus on your skill because that's what matters to them. But all of them will understand that you saved American lives." Chen looked uncomfortable but didn't argue. She understood at some level that Mitchell was right, that her actions had implications that extended far beyond just the tactical battle in the valley. "What about your soldiers?" Chen asked. "How are they processing what happened?" Mitchell smiled slightly. "Better than I might have expected. They're traumatized, certainly. Some are struggling with PTSD. Rodriguez came to me last week with nightmares. Williams, the soldier whose arm was torn open, just got the news that he'll be medically discharged. The nerve damage was more extensive than initially believed. But across the unit, there's also this sense of pride. They survived something that should have been unsurvivable. They held their ground. They believe in themselves in a way they couldn't before." "And you," Chen asked, "how are you processing it?" Mitchell considered the question carefully. "I've replayed that moment 1,000 times. The moment when the ambush hit, when I realized the scale of what we were facing, when I understood that we had minutes of ammunition left and help was far away. And I've replayed the moment I heard your helicopter, heard your voice on the radio telling me you were coming. That moment, when I realized salvation was possible, that we might actually survive, that moment changed me. I understand now, at a level deeper than just intellectual knowledge, that we're never truly alone in this military. There are people like you, people willing to risk everything to save soldiers they've never met. That's profound. That's sacred." Chen felt tears beginning to form but held them back, maintaining her military bearing. "I've thought about it too," she admitted. "About what would have happened if I'd been slower, if my helicopter had malfunctioned, if I'd arrived just a few minutes later. You'd all be dead. 137 soldiers wouldn't be going home to their families, and I would have spent the rest of my life knowing that I'd failed. That weight, knowing that success or failure determined whether you lived or died. I've never felt anything quite like that." Over the next 2 hours they talked. They discussed the battle from both perspectives. They talked about their families, their motivations for joining the military, their hopes for the future. Mitchell learned that Chen's parents still lived in California, that they'd been skeptical about her military career but had come to respect her choices. Chen learned that Mitchell had 2 children, that his oldest was interested in following him into the military, and that his wife had been terrified when she heard about the ambush. As the conversation was winding down, Mitchell pulled out a photograph. It was a group photo of his entire unit, taken after they'd returned to the forward operating base following the battle. All 137 soldiers, standing together, their faces showing the exhaustion of combat but also the determination of survivors. "I wanted you to see them," Mitchell said, sliding the photograph across the table. "These are the people you saved. These are the faces of what courage means. Some of these soldiers will pursue military careers. Some will go home and become teachers, doctors, business people, parents. But all of them will remember that you saved them. That's legacy, Major. That's the real impact of what you did." Chen looked at the photograph for a long time, studying individual faces, trying to commit their images to memory. She could see Rodriguez in the back left, his arm around another young soldier. She could see Williams, his arm in a sling but his face smiling. She could see the medics, the sergeants, the officers, all of them alive because of her actions. "I don't know what to say," Chen said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to say anything," Mitchell replied. "Just know that you matter. What you did matters. And these soldiers, these 137 people and their families, we will never forget what you did for us." As they stood to leave, Mitchell extended his hand one final time. "Whatever comes next in your career, whatever recognition you receive, just remember that you earned every bit of it. You're not famous because you're a woman who flies helicopters. You're famous because you're an extraordinary pilot who saved lives and didn't hesitate to put yourself in danger to do it." In the following months, the story did indeed become public. News outlets picked it up. Military analysts examined every detail of the engagement. Discussions erupted about combat roles for women, about the capabilities of modern attack helicopters, about the nature of courage under fire. Major Sarah Chen's name became increasingly recognized, both within military circles and in the broader public consciousness. But for Chen, the moment that mattered most was the conversation with Mitchell. The photograph of 137 soldiers, the understanding that her actions had created a ripple that would extend into the futures of all those people, their families, their children, their grandchildren. She'd changed the trajectory of hundreds of lives by flying her helicopter into a valley and refusing to fail. Mitchell returned to his unit and eventually rotated home. He went on to have a successful military career, eventually rising to colonel. His children grew up hearing stories about the pilot who'd saved their father. One of them eventually applied to flight school, inspired by the tale of Major Sarah Chen. And Major Chen continued flying combat missions, continued saving lives, continued proving that courage, skill, and determination had nothing to do with gender. She became a mentor to younger female pilots, showing them through her example that there was a place for women in combat operations, that they could be every bit as capable, every bit as heroic, every bit as essential as anyone else. But she never forgot the photograph of 137 soldiers, and she never forgot the moment when a captain in the valley below had told her that her actions had changed history. In the quiet moments, in the moments between missions, both Mitchell and Chen would occasionally find themselves thinking about that day in the valley. They'd think about how close they'd come to losing everything. They'd think about the 4 soldiers who hadn't made it. They'd think about the lives saved and the families preserved. And they'd understand, at a level that transcended words, what it meant to be a soldier, what it meant to be part of something greater than yourself, what it meant to trust someone completely, to depend on someone absolutely, to know that somewhere out there, someone cared enough about your survival to risk everything. That was the legacy of the valley. That was what 137 soldiers and one female pilot had created together. Not just a battle one, but a confirmation of the best qualities of human nature: courage, sacrifice, duty, the willingness to put someone else's survival before your own. In a world that often seemed dark and cynical, that story stood as a beacon, proof that heroism still existed, that extraordinary people still walked among us, and that one person's courage could literally change the world for 137 others. That was a legacy worth remembering.